When I walked into my 16-year-old daughter's room at 3 in the morning and found her hunched over a sewing machine with bloodshot eyes and trembling hands, I thought I was losing my mind. But what I discovered next would expose a web of lies that went deeper than I ever imagined. And the person who would ultimately bring justice wasn't who anyone expected. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. The first red flag should have been Marcus insisting that Emma needed to learn responsibility the week after we got married. At the time, it seemed reasonable. Emma had been struggling since her father died 2 years earlier, and Marcus presented himself as the steady father figure she needed. He was charming, successful, and seemed genuinely invested in our family's future. "She needs structure, Sarah," he'd say, adjusting his tie before heading to his job at the accounting firm. "Kids these days don't understand the value of hard work." Emma had always been artistic. Before Marcus came into our lives, she spent her afternoons sketching, painting, or working on small craft projects. She was talented, really talented, and I'd encouraged her creativity since she was little. But Marcus saw things differently. "Art doesn't pay the bills," he'd remind me whenever he caught Emma drawing instead of doing homework. "She needs practical skills." The sewing machine appeared on a Tuesday. Marcus carried it up to Emma's room himself, explaining that he'd found a learning opportunity for her. Mrs. Chen, who ran a small alterations business downtown, needed help with her overflow work. Simple hemming, basic repairs, nothing too complicated for a beginner. "It'll teach her discipline," Marcus explained as he set up the machine on Emma's desk, pushing aside her art supplies. "And she'll earn a little money. Win-win." Emma's face fell as she watched her creative space being transformed into what looked suspiciously like a workstation. But she nodded quietly, the way she'd started doing whenever Marcus made decisions about her life. The spark that used to light up her eyes when she talked about her art projects had been dimming for months. The first few weeks seemed manageable. Emma would come home from school, do her homework, then spend an hour or two working on alterations. The pay was modest. Marcus collected it directly from Mrs. Chen and deposited it into a savings account for Emma's future. Everything appeared perfectly reasonable on the surface. But then the workload increased. "Mrs. Chen is really impressed with Emma's work," Marcus announced one evening over dinner. "She's got a big wedding coming up, lots of bridesmaids' dresses that need adjustments, extra money for college." Emma pushed her food around her plate. "I have a history test tomorrow. I really need to study." "You can study after you finish the dresses," Marcus replied firmly. "Commitments are commitments, Emma. People are depending on you." The guilt trip was subtle but effective. Emma nodded and disappeared upstairs after dinner. I heard the sewing machine running until nearly midnight. This became the pattern: school, homework, sewing. The machine seemed to run constantly, filling the house with its steady mechanical rhythm. Emma's grades began to slip, and the dark circles under her eyes grew more pronounced. When I tried to discuss it with Marcus, he dismissed my concerns. "She's learning valuable lessons," he'd say. "Responsibility, time management, and the value of honest work. These are skills that will serve her well in life." I wanted to believe him. Marcus had a way of making his arguments sound perfectly logical, perfectly reasonable. And Emma never complained directly. She just grew quieter, more withdrawn. Her art supplies gathered dust, while the pile of clothing needing alterations seemed to grow larger each week. The breaking point came on a Friday night in November. I'd been working late at the insurance office where I processed claims, trying to catch up on paperwork before the weekend. When I got home around 11, the house was dark, except for the thin line of light under Emma's door. I knocked softly. "Honey, you should be getting to sleep." "Just finishing up, Mom," came her muffled reply. But something in her voice didn't sound right. I opened the door and found Emma hunched over the sewing machine, working on what looked like a complicated beaded evening gown. Her hands were shaking from exhaustion, and I could see she'd been crying. "Emma, what's going on? It's almost midnight." She looked up at me with hollow eyes. "Marcus said Mrs. Chen needs this finished by tomorrow morning. It's for some important client." Tomorrow's Saturday. Surely it can wait until Monday. Emma shook her head. He said the client is flying out Sunday morning. If it's not ready, Mrs. Chen could lose her business relationship with this customer, and then she might not be able to give me any more work. The way she said it, like she was reciting lines she'd memorized, made my stomach churn. How long have you been working tonight? Since I got home from school, I had to skip dinner to have enough time. That's when I noticed the plate sitting cold and untouched on her nightstand, and the homework assignment that was clearly only half finished, abandoned in favor of the sewing project. Emma, this isn't right. You're 16 years old. You need sleep, you need to eat, you need time for schoolwork. Marcus says, I don't care what Marcus says. The words came out sharper than I'd intended. Emma flinched, and I immediately softened my tone. I'm sorry, honey, I'm not angry at you, but this has gone too far. Emma's shoulders slumped. For a moment, she looked like the little girl she'd been before life got so complicated. I'm just so tired, Mom, and my fingers hurt all the time now. She held up her hands, and I could see small bandages on several fingers where the needle had pricked her. That's it. You're done for tonight. I moved to turn off the sewing machine, but Emma caught my hand. Please don't. If I don't finish this, Marcus will be angry. He'll say I'm being irresponsible, that I'm letting people down. He'll give me that look, and then he won't talk to me for days. The fear in her voice stopped me cold. This wasn't about learning responsibility or earning college money. This was about control, and Marcus had been systematically tightening his grip on my daughter while I worked long hours and convinced myself everything was fine. Go to bed, I said gently. I'll handle Marcus. Emma's eyes widened. Mom, no, you don't understand. He gets really upset when plans change. Last week, when I couldn't finish everything because I had that dentist appointment, he didn't speak to either of us for 3 days. The whole house felt wrong. That's when I realized how carefully Marcus had been orchestrating everything. The late work hours that kept me out of the house during Emma's sewing time, the way he'd positioned himself as the reasonable authority figure just trying to teach life lessons, the gradual increase in workload that had been so subtle I'd barely noticed it happening. But Emma had noticed. She'd been carrying this burden alone, afraid to complain, because Marcus had convinced her that speaking up would make her selfish and irresponsible. And I'd been so busy trying to make our blended family work that I'd missed the signs. Pack that dress away, I told Emma firmly. Whatever consequences come from not finishing it, I'll handle them. You are not staying up all night sewing. Emma hesitated, then slowly began folding the beaded gown. What are you going to tell Marcus? The truth, that this arrangement isn't working anymore. But as I helped Emma put away the sewing supplies and tucked her into bed, I had no idea that Marcus's reaction to this confrontation would expose something far worse than an overzealous stepfather trying to teach work ethic. The next morning would bring revelations that would turn our entire world upside down, and the person who would ultimately help us navigate the chaos ahead was someone I'd never even mentioned to Marcus. Someone whose job was finding people who exploited children. Someone who happened to be my mother. The confrontation happened at breakfast. Marcus sat at the kitchen table with his coffee and newspaper, the picture of domestic normalcy, when I brought up Emma's workload. I think we need to scale back on the sewing projects, I began carefully, pouring myself coffee. Emma's exhausted, and her grades are suffering. Marcus looked up from his paper with that patient expression he used when I thought I was being emotional. Sarah, we've talked about this. Discipline is exactly what Emma needs right now. You can't just give up every time things get a little challenging. A little challenging? Marcus, she was up until 3 in the morning working on that dress. She's 16, not an adult seamstress. Which is exactly why she needs to learn time management. He folded his newspaper with deliberate precision. If she managed her time better during the day, instead of daydreaming about her art projects, she wouldn't need to work so late. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. The casual dismissal of Emma's artistic talents stung, but I pushed forward. Art isn't daydreaming. It's what she loves, what she's good at. Love doesn't pay for college tuition. Marcus stood and walked to the coffee pot, refilling his mug with measured movements. Emma needs practical skills, not fantasy pursuits. Mrs. Chen is providing valuable real-world experience. At what cost? Look at her, Marcus. Really look at her. She's miserable. For just a moment, something flickered across Marcus's face. Annoyance, maybe even anger, but it was gone so quickly I almost missed it. When he turned back to me, his expression was calm, reasonable. Growing up is hard, Sarah. Emma lost her father, she's adjusting to a new family dynamic, she's a teenager, dealing with normal teenage emotions. Of course she's going to have difficult days, but that doesn't mean we stop preparing her for adulthood. The way he said new family dynamic made it sound like Emma was the problem, like she was somehow failing to adapt rather than being pushed beyond her limits. I felt my resolve strengthening. I've made up my mind. No more late-night sewing sessions. Emma needs balance. Marcus set down his coffee mug with a sharp clink. I see. So you're going to undermine the structure we've worked so hard to establish because Emma had one difficult evening? This isn't about one evening, Marcus. This has been building for months. Has it? His voice remained level, but there was something new in his eyes. Or is this about you feeling guilty for working late and not being here to supervise? The accusation hit its mark. I have been working longer hours lately, trying to prove myself at the insurance company after getting a promotion, but that didn't change what I'd witnessed. Don't turn this around on me. This is about what's best for Emma. What's best for Emma is learning that the world doesn't revolve around her feelings. Marcus picked up his briefcase, checking his watch. But if you want to coddle her and set her up for failure, that's your choice as her mother. The conversation should have ended there, but something made me push further. Maybe it was the cold way he said her mother, emphasizing that Emma wasn't his responsibility. Maybe it was the realization that he'd been gradually isolating Emma from everything she enjoyed. What exactly is your arrangement with Mrs. Chen? Marcus paused, his hand on the briefcase handle. What do you mean? I mean, how much is Emma actually earning? Because she never seems to have any money, and I've never seen any bank statements for this college savings account. I handle the financial arrangements. Emma doesn't need to worry about money management yet. But I do. I'm her mother. I should know how much she's earning and where that money is going. The silence stretched between us. Marcus straightened his tie, a gesture I'd learned meant he was buying time to think. Mrs. Chen pays based on completed pieces. Some weeks Emma earns more, some weeks less. I've been averaging it out and making regular deposits. I can show you the account information later. I'd like to see it today. I'm late for work. Marcus moved toward the door. We can discuss this tonight when we're both less emotional. But I was done waiting for convenient times to discuss my daughter's welfare. After Marcus left, I called the insurance office and told them I'd be in late. Then I drove across town to Chen's Alterations. The shop was tucked between a nail salon and a cell phone repair store, with a hand-painted sign and mannequins wearing perfectly fitted dresses in the window. Mrs. Chen was a tiny woman with silver hair, who looked up with surprise when I introduced myself as Emma's mother. Oh, Emma, such a sweet girl, very talented with the needle. I wanted to thank you for giving her this opportunity, I began, trying to feel out the situation. The extra money for college will really help. Mrs. Chen's expression shifted slightly. Extra money? For the alterations work she's been doing. Ah, Mrs. Chen nodded slowly. Yes, Emma does beautiful work, but I must ask, how much is she charging you? The question caught me off guard. Charging me? For the lessons. When Mr. Marcus first brought Emma here, he explained that she wanted to learn professional sewing skills. I told him I don't usually take on students, but he offered to pay for private instruction. Very generous of him. My stomach dropped. Pay for instruction? Yes, $50 per session. Emma comes twice a week for lessons, sometimes more when she wants extra practice time. She's very dedicated, though I worry sometimes she pushes herself too hard. The room seemed to tilt. Mrs. Chen, I think there's been a misunderstanding. Emma has been bringing you completed work, alterations for your customers. Mrs. Chen's face paled. No. Emma only works on practice pieces during her lessons. Old garments I provide for her to learn on. She takes them home to finish, but they aren't for customers. What about wedding dresses? The beaded evening gown she was working on last night? I don't understand. I don't have any weddings scheduled this month, and I would never give such expensive work to a student, especially to take home. The implications hit me like a physical blow. Marcus hadn't been teaching Emma responsibility or helping her earn college money. He'd been charging us for fake sewing lessons while forcing Emma to work on mysterious projects that had nothing to do with Mrs. Chen's business. Mrs. Chen, I need to ask you something important. Has Emma ever seemed afraid or upset during her lessons? Mrs. Chen hesitated. She's always very quiet, very focused, but sometimes, she paused, choosing her words carefully, sometimes when I try to talk to her about technique or suggest she take a break, she gets anxious. She says she needs to finish everything perfectly or someone will be disappointed in her. Someone? She never says who, but Emma works like she's afraid to make mistakes. That's not how creativity should feel. I thanked Mrs. Chen and left the shop with my mind racing. If Emma wasn't doing alterations for Mrs. Chen's customers, what was she sewing? Who was Marcus working with? And where was the money actually coming from? The answer started falling into place when I got home and found Emma's room empty. Her backpack was gone, which meant she was still at school, but the sewing machine was running. I could hear it through the walls. I followed the sound downstairs to Marcus's home office, a room I rarely entered because he claimed he needed it for client work. The door was usually locked, but today it stood slightly ajar. Inside, I found not just Emma's sewing machine, but 3 others set up around the room. Completed garments hung from portable racks, dozens of them. Designer knockoffs, I realized, looking at the labels. Expensive-looking handbags sat in neat rows on shelves. And in the corner, boxes and boxes of what appeared to be finished products ready for shipping. Marcus wasn't teaching Emma responsibility. He was running an illegal counterfeiting operation out of our house, and he'd been using my 16-year-old daughter as unpaid labor. But what I discovered next, hidden in his desk drawer, would prove that this was just the beginning of Marcus's crimes. The desk drawer shouldn't have been unlocked. Marcus was meticulous about security, always locking his office, always password protecting his computer. But in his rush to leave after our confrontation that morning, he'd made a mistake. Inside the drawer, underneath folders of what looked like legitimate accounting work, I found something that made my blood run cold. Bank statements. Not for Emma's college fund, but for 3 different accounts I'd never seen before. The deposits were staggering, thousands of dollars coming in weekly from sources labeled only as merchandise sales and consulting fees. But it was the notebook beneath the bank statements that truly terrified me. Page after page of handwritten entries tracking production quotas, shipping schedules, and worker assignments. And not just Emma's name, there were others. Jennifer M., age 15, David L., age 16, Carmen R., age 14. Marcus had been recruiting other children. Each entry detailed specific skills, productivity rates, and something that made my stomach churn: reliability scores. Emma had a note beside her name: high compliance, minimal supervision required, responds well to guilt-based motivation, mother works late, minimal interference. He'd been studying my family like a business opportunity, calculating exactly how much he could exploit Emma without getting caught. I photographed everything with shaking hands, then carefully returned the items to their original positions. Emma would be home from school in an hour, and I needed to figure out what to do before Marcus returned from work. The smart thing would have been to call the police immediately, but as I stood in that office, surrounded by evidence of child exploitation, all I could think about was how Emma had looked the night before: exhausted, frightened, convinced that speaking up would make her selfish and irresponsible. How many other kids were going through the same thing right now? How many parents had no idea their children were being used? That's when I remembered something Marcus didn't know about me, something I'd never told him because it seemed irrelevant to our suburban life together.
My mother wasn't just retired, she was retired from the FBI. Agent Catherine Walsh had spent 30 years investigating white-collar crime, with a specialty in operations that exploited vulnerable populations. She'd moved to Phoenix after retiring, claiming she wanted sunshine and golf, but I knew she missed the work. We talked every Sunday, but our conversations usually centered around Emma's school activities and my job at the insurance company. I'd never mentioned that Marcus sometimes seemed controlling, or that Emma had grown quieter since we married. It felt like normal family adjustment issues, the kind of thing you work through with patience and communication. Now I realized I'd been protecting the wrong person. I called my mother from the car, parked in the grocery store lot where I could see our house but wouldn't be overheard. "Sarah, you don't usually call on weekdays. Is everything all right?" "Mom, I need your help. Professional help." My voice cracked on the words. "I think Marcus is involved in something illegal, and Emma's caught in the middle of it." The change in my mother's tone was immediate. Gone was the casual warmth, replaced by the sharp focus I remembered from my childhood when she'd take certain phone calls late at night. "Tell me everything. Start from the beginning, and don't leave out any details you think might be irrelevant." So I did. The sewing lessons were actually unpaid labor. The fake story about Mrs. Chen's customers, the discovery of the counterfeiting operation, and the notebook full of other children's names, the bank accounts with thousands of dollars Marcus had been hiding. My mother listened without interrupting, occasionally asking specific questions about timelines and exact wording of conversations. "Sarah, you need to get Emma out of that house immediately. Don't go back, don't pack anything, don't confront Marcus. Drive straight to Emma's school, check her out, and bring her to my house in Phoenix." "But what about evidence? If Marcus realizes what I found, he'll destroy everything." "The evidence doesn't matter if Emma gets hurt. This isn't just counterfeiting, Sarah. What you're describing is organized labor trafficking using minors. Marcus isn't just some guy who got in over his head. He's running a sophisticated operation that specifically targets children from vulnerable families."
The words hit me like ice water. Labor trafficking. Emma wasn't just doing extra chores or learning work skills. She was a victim of human trafficking, and I'd been living with her trafficker for 8 months. How did I miss this? How did I not see what was happening? Because people like Marcus are experts at manipulation. They choose their targets carefully. Single mothers, blended families, situations where the children might not have strong support systems, or where parents are distracted by other stressors. Your promotion at work, the adjustment period after marriage, Emma still grieving her father, Marcus calculated all of that. I thought about the timing of when the sewing projects intensified, how it coincided perfectly with my longer work hours, how Marcus had positioned himself as the solution to Emma's behavioral issues while gradually isolating her from everything she enjoyed. What happens now? You get Emma safe first, then I make some calls. I still have contacts in the bureau who handle these cases. But Sarah, I need you to understand, once we start this process, there's no going back. Marcus will be arrested, your marriage will be over, and Emma may need counseling to deal with what she's been through. I don't care about marriage, I just want Emma safe. Good, that's exactly what I needed to hear. I drove to Emma's school in a daze, trying to process the fact that my teenage daughter was a trafficking victim and my husband was a criminal who'd been operating under our roof for months. Emma looked surprised when she was called out of her chemistry class. "Mom, what's wrong? You look upset." "We're taking a trip to see Grandma Catherine," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Pack up your things." "What about Marcus? Won't he be angry if I don't work on those dresses tonight?" The casual way she said it, the automatic assumption that her stepfather's anger was something to be managed and avoided, confirmed everything my mother had told me about how trafficking victims adapt to their situations. "You don't have to worry about Marcus anymore," I said. "Grandma Catherine is going to help us figure everything out." Emma looked confused but didn't argue. She'd learned not to question adult decisions, especially ones that might disrupt the carefully maintained peace in our household. As we drove toward Phoenix, Emma fell asleep in the passenger seat, probably for the first time in months without worrying about unfinished sewing projects or disappointing someone with her productivity levels.
I called my mother to let her know we were on the way. How long will it take for your FBI contacts to move on this? I asked. They're already moving. I called Agent Martinez while you were getting Emma. She's heading up a task force that's been tracking this exact type of operation. Apparently, they've been investigating a network of counterfeit goods being produced using child labor, but they haven't been able to identify the specific locations or operators. You mean this is bigger than just Marcus? Much bigger. Marcus is probably a regional coordinator, not the person at the top. The notebook you found with the other children's names, that's the breakthrough the task force has been waiting for. As Phoenix came into view, I realized that Emma and I weren't just escaping from Marcus. We were about to become key witnesses in dismantling an entire criminal network that had been exploiting children across multiple states. And tomorrow, when Marcus came home expecting to find his compliant stepdaughter ready for another night of unpaid labor, he'd instead find FBI agents waiting to arrest him. Catherine Walsh lived in a sprawling ranch house that looked like every other retirement home in her Phoenix suburb, but the security system and reinforced windows hinted at her former profession. When she opened the door, I saw the mother I remembered from childhood, sharp eyes that missed nothing, the kind of calm presence that made you feel both completely safe and slightly intimidated. Emma hung back behind me, uncertain. She'd only met her grandmother a few times, usually during brief holiday visits that Marcus had gradually made excuses to avoid. As Emma disappeared up the stairs, Catherine's demeanor shifted completely. "Show me the photos you took." I handed her my phone, watching her face as she scrolled through the images of Marcus's records. Her expression grew darker with each photo. "This is more sophisticated than I initially thought. These aren't random kids he found. Look at these addresses." She pointed to entries in the notebook, all within a 40-mile radius of your house, all from single-parent households, all children between 14 and 17. How can you tell me about the single-parent part? Experience. Traffickers target specific vulnerabilities. Children in blended families or with absent parents are easier to isolate because there are fewer adults monitoring their daily activities. Catherine set down the phone and moved to her computer. "I'm sending these photos to Agent Martinez now. She'll want to move fast. If Marcus realizes you're gone, he'll start destroying evidence." While Catherine worked, I went upstairs to check on Emma. I found her sitting on the bed in the smallest of the guest rooms, staring out the window at the desert landscape. "This is weird, isn't it?" she said without looking at me. "Running away to Grandma's house like we're in some kind of trouble." I sat beside her, choosing my words carefully. "Emma, you know how Marcus has been having you do all that sewing work?" "Yeah." Her voice was small. "It wasn't what he told us it was. Mrs. Chen never hired you to do alterations for her customers. Marcus was lying about that." Emma turned to look at me, confusion clouding her features. "What do you mean?" "He was using you to make illegal copies of expensive clothes and accessories. You weren't learning job skills or earning college money. You were being forced to work for free in his business." I watched the information sink in and saw the moment when Emma's face changed from confusion to something that looked like relief mixed with anger. "So all those times he made me stay up late because some customer was waiting for their dress, that was fake?" All of it was fake. The college savings account, the life lessons about responsibility, the idea that people were depending on your work. Marcus made all of that up to keep you working. Emma was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice was stronger than I'd heard in months. I knew something was wrong. The things he had me making, some of them had labels that looked exactly like designer brands, but the fabrics were cheap, and he never let me see any actual customer orders or receipts. "Why didn't you say anything?"
Because he always made it sound like questioning him meant I was being ungrateful or immature. Like good kids just did what they were told without making problems for their parents. Emma's hands clenched into fists. And because I was scared that if I complained, you'd think I was just trying to get out of work. The guilt hit me fresh. Marcus had manipulated both of us, but he'd isolated Emma so thoroughly that she'd been afraid to reach out to her own mother. "Emma, I need you to know that none of this was your fault. What Marcus did to you, making you work those hours, lying about the reasons, making you scared to speak up, that wasn't normal stepfather behavior. That was abuse." Before Emma could respond, Catherine appeared in the doorway. "Sarah, Agent Martinez wants to speak with both of you. She's driving up from the field office." Agent Maria Martinez arrived 2 hours later with a team of 3 other agents. She was younger than I'd expected, probably in her 30s, with the kind of focused intensity that reminded me of Catherine in her working days. Mrs. Coleman, I want to thank you for bringing this information forward. What your husband has been doing is part of a larger network we've been tracking for 18 months. She set up a laptop on Catherine's dining room table, pulling up files that made my stomach drop. Photos of other children, other sewing setups, shipping records that showed the scope of the operation. We've identified at least 12 locations across 3 states where children are being used to produce counterfeit goods. The network generates approximately $2 million annually, all of it built on unpaid child labor. $2 million? I couldn't hide my shock. The profit margins are enormous when your workforce costs nothing. These operations specifically target children because they're less likely to understand their legal rights, more susceptible to authority figures, and easier to control through psychological manipulation. Agent Martinez turned to Emma. I know this is overwhelming, but I need to ask you some questions about your experiences. Would that be okay? Emma nodded, sitting straighter in her chair. How many other children did you ever see or hear about doing similar work? I never saw anyone else, but Marcus sometimes talked on the phone about productivity numbers and comparing different units. I thought he meant business clients, but now… Emma paused. Now I think he was talking about kids like me. Did Marcus ever threaten you directly? Not exactly threats, but he had this way of making everything sound like it was my choice, and if I made the wrong choice, I'd be letting everyone down. He said things like, I guess some people just aren't ready for adult responsibilities, or, it's disappointing when children don't appreciate the opportunities they're given. Agent Martinez exchanged glances with Catherine. Classic psychological conditioning. Did he ever try to isolate you from friends or activities? He didn't say I couldn't do things, but whenever I had plans, he'd suddenly have rush projects that needed to be finished. So I started turning down invitations because I knew there'd be consequences if the work didn't get done. As Emma described months of systematic manipulation, I realized how carefully Marcus had orchestrated everything. He'd never left obvious bruises or made explicit threats. Instead, he'd created an environment where Emma policed her own behavior out of fear of disappointing him. What happens now? I asked. Agent Martinez closed her laptop. Tomorrow morning, we will execute simultaneous raids on all 12 locations we've identified. Marcus will be arrested along with 7 other regional coordinators. But we need Emma's testimony to make sure the charges stick. What kind of charges? Human trafficking, child labor exploitation, money laundering, counterfeiting, and conspiracy. He's looking at 20 to 30 years in federal prison. Emma had been quiet during this exchange, but now she spoke up. What about the other kids, the ones whose names were in his notebook? They'll be safe by tomorrow night. We have social workers standing by to help them and their families understand what happened and get the support they need. As the agents prepared to leave, Agent Martinez handed me her card. Mrs. Coleman, you should know that your quick action probably saved your daughter from months or years of additional exploitation. Many trafficking victims aren't rescued until the psychological conditioning is much more severe. After they left, Emma and I sat in Catherine's living room, processing everything that had happened. Mom, can I ask you something? Anything. How did you know Grandma Catherine would be able to help with something like this? I smiled for the first time in days. Your grandmother spent 30 years putting people like Marcus in prison. If anyone was going to know how to stop him, it was going to be her. Emma looked over at Catherine, who was cleaning up the dinner dishes. I can't believe my grandma was FBI. Retired FBI, Catherine corrected from the kitchen, but some habits never die. The next morning, we'd watch the news coverage of the raids. We'd see Marcus led away in handcuffs, along with other adults whose names I didn't recognize, but whose crimes were identical to his. And we'd begin the long process of helping Emma heal from months of exploitation by someone who was supposed to protect her.
The raids happened at 6 a.m. across 3 states simultaneously. Catherine had her police scanner on, and we listened to the coordinated chatter as federal agents moved in on locations from Nevada to Texas. Emma sat beside me on the couch, her hands wrapped around a mug of coffee, watching the local news for any updates. 12 locations raided in a multi-state trafficking operation, the anchor announced. 7 adults arrested in what FBI officials are calling one of the largest child labor exploitation rings uncovered in the Southwest. When Marcus's photo appeared on screen, his accounting firm headshot looking respectable and ordinary, Emma made a sound that was half laugh, half sob. "He looks so normal," she said, "like someone's dad picking up groceries." "That's exactly what made him dangerous," Catherine replied from her chair across the room. "The ones who look like monsters are easy to spot. The ones who look like everyone else, those are the predators who get away with it for years." My phone buzzed with a text from Agent Martinez. "All targets secured. Your house is clear if you need to collect belongings. Escort available if requested." The thought of going back to that house made my stomach turn. But Emma needed her things, her real art supplies, her books, the few personal items that Marcus hadn't managed to replace with sewing equipment. "Do you want to go back and get your stuff?" I asked Emma. She considered it for a moment. "Yeah, but I don't want to go alone." Catherine stood up. "I'll drive you both. It's been a while since I've seen a crime scene."
The house looked smaller somehow when we pulled into the driveway. Yellow tape blocked off Marcus's office, but the rest of the property was accessible. Agent Martinez met us at the front door. "We've collected everything we need for evidence," she said. "Take whatever you want from Emma's room and any personal belongings. The house will be sealed again tomorrow pending asset forfeiture proceedings." Emma's room felt like stepping back in time. Her art supplies sat exactly where Marcus had pushed them aside months ago. Sketchbooks, colored pencils, the easel her father had bought her for her 14th birthday. Dust covered everything, but nothing had been thrown away. "I can't believe he just left all this stuff here," Emma said, running her fingers over her neglected paintbrushes. "He wanted you to see it every day," I realized, a reminder of what you'd given up to be responsible. While Emma packed her art supplies, I wandered through the house that had been my home for 8 months. Everything looked different now that I knew what Marcus had been hiding. The closed office door that I'd respected as his private workspace, the frequent late-night phone calls he'd claimed were client emergencies, the way he'd always known exactly when I'd be working late. In our bedroom, former bedroom, I found the framed photo from our wedding day. Marcus and I looked happy, hopeful. Emma stood beside us in a blue dress, smiling but not quite reaching her eyes. I wondered now if she'd already sensed something was wrong, if some instinct had warned her about this man we'd welcomed into our family. Agent Martinez appeared in the doorway. "Mrs. Coleman, we found something else you should know about. Marcus had been documenting your work schedule, Emma's school activities, even your mother's phone calls to the house. He kept detailed records of your family's routines." She handed me a folder marked with my name. Inside were printouts of my work calendar, notes about my personality, avoids confrontation, guilt responsive, focused on appearing like a good mother, and what looked like a recruitment strategy. Recruitment strategy? Marcus wasn't randomly abusing his stepdaughter. He specifically chose you and Emma as targets. Single mother, recently promoted at work, teenage daughter still grieving her father's death. He calculated the exact vulnerabilities he could exploit. The manipulation had started before we'd even met. Marcus had seen us at Emma's school art show. I remembered now. He'd struck up a conversation about Emma's talent, how mature and responsible she seemed for her age. What I thought was genuine interest had been an assessment. How many other families did he target this way? We're still investigating, but preliminary evidence suggests at least 15 families over the past 5 years. You and Emma were just the most recent. Emma appeared in the hallway, carrying 2 boxes of art supplies. "Can we go now? This place feels wrong." As we loaded Emma's belongings into Catherine's car, I took one last look at the house where I thought we were building a new life together. The lawn Marcus had maintained so perfectly,
the front porch where we'd sat drinking coffee on Sunday mornings, the mailbox with both our names on it. All of it had been part of an elaborate performance designed to hide the systematic exploitation of children. 3 weeks later, Emma and I sat in a federal courthouse in downtown Phoenix. Marcus had been denied bail and was being held pending trial, along with the 6 other regional coordinators who'd been arrested in the raids. The prosecutor, a sharp woman named Janet Ross, was walking us through what to expect during testimony. The defense will try to characterize this as a misunderstanding or claim that Marcus genuinely believed he was teaching Emma valuable skills, she explained. They'll say the late hours and pressure were just poor judgment, not intentional exploitation. Emma had been quiet through most of the meeting, but now she spoke up. What about the other kids? Will they have to testify too? Some of them, yes. But Emma, your testimony is particularly important because you can speak to the psychological manipulation tactics. You were articulate enough to recognize what was happening even while it was happening to you. I wasn't that articulate. I was scared all the time. But you noticed details, the fake customer stories, the way Marcus used guilt to control your behavior, the gradual increase in workload. Those details help establish the pattern of deliberate exploitation rather than just poor parenting. The trial lasted 6 days. Emma testified on the 4th day, wearing a blue dress that reminded me of the one from our wedding photo, except this time her eyes were clear and determined. She spoke about the fear of disappointing Marcus, about staying awake until dawn working on counterfeit designer clothes, about giving up her art because there wasn't time for fantasy pursuits. She described the relief of learning that the college savings account was fake, that all her sacrifice had been for nothing except Marcus's profit. The defense attorney tried to shake her story, suggesting she'd been coached by the FBI or that she was exaggerating because she was angry about the divorce. Emma looked directly at the jury when she responded. I don't need coaching to remember being tired all the time. I don't need coaching to remember how my fingers bled from needle pricks. And I don't need coaching to remember thinking that if I just worked harder, if I just complained less, maybe I could make my family happy again. Marcus was convicted on all charges. 28 years in federal prison, with eligibility for parole after 18 years. The other coordinators received similar sentences. The network that had exploited dozens of children across 3 states was completely dismantled. 6 months after the trial, Emma had her first art show since Marcus entered our lives. It was a small exhibition at the local community center, featuring work she'd created during her recovery. The centerpiece was a mixed-media installation called Invisible Chains, sewing machine parts around a canvas painted with children's handprints. Catherine stood beside me as we watched Emma explain her work to visitors. She's remarkable, you know. Most trafficking survivors take years to find their voice again. She had a good advocate, I said, squeezing my mother's hand. Thank you for knowing exactly what to do when I called. That's what mothers are for, even retired FBI mothers. Emma joined us after the last visitor left, her face glowing with the satisfaction of sharing her art again. Mom, can I ask you something? Anything. Do you think Dad would be proud of how we handled this? I looked at my daughter, my strong, creative, resilient daughter who'd survived systematic exploitation and chosen to transform that experience into art that might help other people understand what trafficking really looked like. Emma, I think your dad would be incredibly proud of both of us. As we drove home under the desert stars, I realized that Marcus had been right about one thing. Emma had learned valuable lessons about responsibility, time management, and the value of honest work. She'd just learned them by surviving his lies and choosing to tell the truth instead. 2 years after Marcus's conviction, I received a phone call that changed everything again, but this time in a way I never could have expected. Life had settled into a new rhythm by then. Emma was thriving in her senior year of high school, her art teacher constantly praising her portfolio development. I'd been promoted to senior claims investigator at the insurance company, and my colleagues often joked that I had a sixth sense for detecting fraud. They had no idea how accurate that assessment was.
Catherine had moved closer to us, buying a small house just 20 minutes away. She claimed it was because she missed the excitement of our lives, but I knew she wanted to be nearby as Emma prepared for college. The three of us had become an unbreakable unit, bound together by the shared experience of surviving and overcoming Marcus's manipulation. Mrs. Coleman, this is Detective Lisa Park with the Denver Police Department. I'm calling about the Marcus Coleman case. My blood ran cold. Marcus was supposed to be in federal prison for another 16 years. Is he trying to appeal again? No, ma'am. Marcus is still incarcerated, but we've uncovered something during a separate investigation that involves your case. We found the person who was running the entire operation. Emma looked up from her college application essays, sensing the tension in my voice. She was applying to art schools now, her portfolio filled with pieces about resilience, justice, and hope. The trauma hadn't disappeared, but she'd transformed it into something powerful. What do you mean, the person running it? Marcus and the other regional coordinators weren't at the top of the pyramid. They were middle management. We've identified the actual kingpin, a woman named Victoria Chen. The name hit me like a physical blow. Chen? Like Mrs. Chen from the alterations shop? Mrs. Chen's daughter-in-law, Victoria Chen, has been operating under multiple identities across 8 states for the past decade. She recruits local operators like Marcus, provides them with the counterfeiting materials and client networks, then takes 70% of the profits. Emma had moved closer, listening to my side of the conversation with a growing alarm. Her college applications were spread across the kitchen table, art schools from California to New York, each one representing a future Marcus had tried to steal from her. The irony wasn't lost on me that this call was coming just as Emma was preparing to fully reclaim her life. "How did you find Victoria Chen?" I asked Detective Park. "A warehouse fire in Colorado. When investigators sifted through the debris, they found industrial sewing equipment, thousands of counterfeit labels, and shipping records that connected to operations across 8 states. Victoria Chen owned the building under one of her false identities." False identities? At least 12 different names, complete with social security numbers, driver's licenses, business registrations. She's been running this network like a multinational corporation, with regional managers in every major metropolitan area from Seattle to Miami. I thought about Marcus sitting in his federal prison cell, probably still believing he'd been running his own independent operation. In reality, he'd been nothing more than a well-paid employee in Victoria Chen's criminal empire. Detective Park, Mrs. Chen at the alterations shop, was she involved? No, that's the most disturbing part. Victoria Chen specifically chose to use her mother-in-law's legitimate business as cover without her knowledge. Mrs. Chen had no idea her shop was being used to validate the fake stories Marcus told you and Emma. In fact, when we interviewed her, she was devastated. She genuinely believed she was helping a young girl learn valuable skills. This revelation hit particularly hard. Mrs. Chen's kindness and concern for Emma had been real. She'd worried about Emma working too hard, had tried to encourage breaks during their sessions, and had praised Emma's natural talent with fabric and thread. Victoria Chen had weaponized her mother-in-law's genuine care to make her trafficking operation more convincing. We found correspondence between Marcus and Marcus dating back 3 years before he ever met your family, Detective Park continued. She'd been grooming him for the recruitment, teaching him exactly what kind of family dynamic to target, what psychological pressure points would be most effective. The manipulation had been even more sophisticated than we'd realized. Victoria Chen had created an entire fictional ecosystem around the trafficking operation, using real businesses and real people as unwitting props in her criminal enterprise. Marcus hadn't stumbled into trafficking Emma, he'd been systematically trained for it. Why are you calling me now? Because Victoria Chen is finally going to trial next month, and the prosecution wants Emma to testify. Not just about Marcus, but about the broader network.
Emma's case represents the clearest example of how the operation functioned, from recruitment to exploitation. The prosecutor had specifically requested Emma's testimony because her case demonstrated the full life cycle of Victoria Chen's operation. Unlike some victims who had been trafficked for shorter periods or didn't understand the connections between their local abusers and the larger network, Emma could speak to the systematic nature of the psychological manipulation, the standardized materials and procedures, and the way legitimate businesses were used to create false legitimacy. After I hung up, Emma sat in silence for a long time, absently organizing her art supplies, a nervous habit she'd developed during recovery. "I thought we were done," she finally said. "I thought Marcus going to prison meant it was over." "It is over for you," I assured her. "You don't have to testify if you don't want to." "But what about the other kids? If Victoria Chen was running operations in 8 states, Emma's voice trailed off as she calculated the implications. How many children do you think she hurt?" Emma had been seeing Dr. Patricia Reyes, a trauma specialist who works specifically with trafficking survivors, for the past 18 months. One of the things Dr. Reyes had helped Emma understand was that her desire to help other victims was both natural and healthy, but that she needed to balance that impulse with protecting her own emotional well-being. "Emma, whatever you decide, we'll support you completely," I said, "but I want you to talk to Dr. Reyes before you make any commitments. This trial could be more intense than Marcus's case." That afternoon, we drove to Catherine's house to discuss the situation. My mother had been following Victoria's case through her FBI contacts, and her insights were sobering. "Victoria Chen has been operating for 12 years, Catherine explained, spreading case files across her dining room table. Conservative estimates suggest her network exploited over 200 children during that time." 200? Emma's voice was barely a whisper. "The FBI has been building this case for 3 years. They needed Marcus's conviction to establish the operational pattern, and now they need victim testimony to show the human impact." Catherine pulled out a thick folder marked "Confidential" in red letters. "Emma, before you make any decision about testifying, you need to understand what you'd be walking into. This isn't just about Victoria Chen anymore." She opened the folder, revealing organizational charts that looked like something from a corporate presentation. Names, photographs, and connecting lines showed the structure of what appeared to be a massive criminal enterprise. Victoria Chen's operation had 5 tiers, Catherine explained. At the top, Victoria herself, coordinating everything from a compound in rural Montana. Below her, regional supervisors who managed operations in specific geographic areas. Then, regional coordinators like Marcus who handled individual families. Below them, recruiters who identified potential victims. And finally, what they called containment specialists, people whose job was to prevent victims from seeking help. Emma studied the chart with the focused attention she usually reserved for her art projects. Containment specialists? People who monitored the victim's online activity, their school performance, their social connections. If a child started showing signs of rebellion or seeking help, the containment specialists would intervene. How would they intervene? Catherine hesitated. Sometimes through increased isolation, sometimes through threats against family members. In extreme cases, she glanced at me before continuing, in extreme cases, through direct physical intimidation. The room fell silent as we absorbed this information. Emma had been fortunate. Marcus's psychological manipulation had been effective enough that no containment specialists had been necessary, but other children in the network hadn't been so lucky. Emma studied the photographs Catherine had shown us, crime scene photos from other locations, evidence of counterfeiting operations that dwarfed what we'd found in Marcus's office, industrial sewing facilities that looked more like factories than home offices, dormitory-style housing where some victims had been kept, financial records showing millions of dollars in profits. "If I testify, will it help make sure she gets convicted?" "Your testimony would be powerful," Catherine said carefully, "but Emma, you need to make this decision based on what's right for you, not what might help the prosecution." Emma was quiet for several minutes, studying the case files with an intensity that reminded me of Catherine during her FBI days. Finally, she looked up at both of us. What's right for me is making sure Victoria Chen can't hurt anyone else. The weeks leading up to the trial were challenging in ways we hadn't anticipated. Emma received threatening messages on social media from accounts that were quickly traced back to associates of Victoria Chen's operation who hadn't yet been arrested. The FBI arranged for additional security, and Emma temporarily moved in with Catherine for protection. "These people really don't want me to testify," Emma observed one evening as we reviewed another batch of threats with Agent Martinez. "They're desperate," Agent Martinez replied. "Emma's testimony connects Victoria Chen directly to the systematic abuse of children. Without victim testimony, the defense can claim this was just a financial crime, counterfeiting and tax evasion. With Emma's testimony, the jury sees the human cost." Dr. Reyes worked with Emma daily to prepare her emotionally for the trial experience. Unlike the Marcus trial, where Emma had been testifying against someone she knew personally, this would involve describing her experiences to strangers, while Victoria Chen, the person who had orchestrated her suffering from a distance, sat just feet away. "Remember," Dr. Reyes coached Emma, "you're not responsible for the outcome of this trial. You're simply telling your truth. Whatever the jury decides, you've done your part by speaking honestly about your experiences." The federal courthouse in Denver was massive compared to the Phoenix building where we'd testified against Marcus. Emma wore a navy blue suit that Catherine had helped her choose, professional, confident, but still age-appropriate for an 18-year-old college-bound survivor. Media trucks lined the street outside, and we entered through a secure entrance to avoid the cameras. Victoria Chen looked nothing like I'd expected. Instead of the criminal mastermind I'd imagined, she appeared to be an ordinary middle-aged woman in a conservative business suit. She could have been anyone's mother, anyone's neighbor. Her attorney was a high-powered defense lawyer from New York who had flown in specifically for this case, a sign of how much money Victoria Chen had made from her trafficking operation. "That's what made her so effective," Agent Martinez explained during our pretrial meeting. "Victoria Chen cultivated an image of respectability while coordinating one of the largest child trafficking operations the Bureau has ever investigated." The prosecution had been preparing for this trial for 3 years. In addition to Emma, they planned to call 17 other victims, 8 former regional coordinators who had agreed to cooperate in exchange for reduced sentences, and dozens of law enforcement officers who had investigated different aspects of the network.
The defense strategy will be to claim that Victoria Chen was simply running a counterfeiting operation and that any exploitation of children was the result of regional coordinators like Marcus exceeding their authority, the prosecutor explained. "Your testimony helps prove that the child labor was intentional and systematic, not an accident." Emma's testimony lasted 3 hours. She spoke not just about her own experiences with Marcus, but about the broader patterns she'd observed. The way Marcus had seemed to be following a script in his manipulation tactics. The standardized materials and equipment that suggested mass production rather than individual criminal activity. The specific psychological techniques that had been used to keep her compliant and afraid to seek help. The defense attorney's cross-examination was aggressive in a way that Marcus's lawyer had never been. He questioned Emma's memory, suggested she was exaggerating her suffering for attention, and implied that her artistic nature made her prone to fantasy and drama. But Emma had spent 2 years in therapy learning to trust her own perceptions and validate her own experiences. When the defense attorney suggested that she was confused about the timeline of events, Emma calmly pulled out a journal she'd kept during her trafficking experience. "I started writing in this journal 6 months after Marcus moved in with us," she said, holding up the small notebook. "I wrote down what happened each day because I was starting to feel like I was losing my mind. Marcus would tell me one thing happened, but I remembered it differently. The journal helped me keep track of reality." But the moment that seemed to have the greatest impact on the jury came when the prosecution asked Emma about her current life. "I'm starting art school in the fall," Emma said, her voice steady and clear. "I'm planning to major in art therapy with a focus on working with trauma survivors." What inspired that career choice? Emma looked directly at Victoria Chen before answering. Someone once told me that my art was just fantasy, that it couldn't help anyone or change anything real. I want to prove that was wrong. Art can heal people, it can help them find their voices again, and it can make sure stories like mine get told so that other families know what to watch for. Victoria Chen was convicted on 47 counts of human trafficking, racketeering, money laundering, and conspiracy. The judge sentenced her to life in prison without the possibility of parole. This operation, the judge said during sentencing, represents a systematic and calculated exploitation of the most vulnerable members of our society. The defendant showed no regard for the devastating impact of her crimes on children and families across multiple states. 3 months later, Emma started her freshman year at the California Institute of the Arts. Her dorm room was filled with her paintings, vibrant, hopeful pieces that bore no resemblance to the dark themes that had characterized her work immediately after the trafficking experience. But she kept one piece from that difficult period, a small sketch she'd drawn during one of her therapy sessions, showing a girl breaking free from invisible chains. It sat on her desk as a reminder of how far she'd traveled. On the anniversary of Marcus's arrest, Elma called me from her dorm. "Mom, I got accepted into the art therapy graduate program early admission track." "Emma, that's wonderful. How do you feel?" "Proud, and I'm grateful, and ready to help other kids find their way back to themselves." "Your father would be so proud of who you've become." "I think he'd be proud of both of us. We didn't just survive what happened, we used it to make sure other families won't have to go through the same thing." After we hung up, I sat in my new apartment, the one Emma and I had chosen together after selling the house where Marcus had operated his criminal enterprise. The walls were covered with Emma's artwork, including several pieces she'd created specifically for our new home. The centerpiece was a painting called After the Storm, a landscape showing sunlight breaking through dark clouds, illuminating a path forward through previously shadowed terrain. Catherine had been right that first night in Phoenix when she'd told me there was no going back once we started the process. Our old life had been completely destroyed, but what we'd built in its place was stronger, more honest, and built on a foundation that no criminal could ever exploit again. Emma had learned about responsibility, time management, and the value of honest work. She'd learned it by refusing to let anyone silence her voice, by transforming her trauma into art that could heal others, and by choosing to use her experience to protect future victims. And she'd learned that sometimes the most important thing you can do is tell the truth, even when, especially when, powerful people don't want you to speak. The invisible chains were broken, and Emma was finally free to create the life she was meant to live. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.